I'm going to just rehash a few apologies if you've heard this before, but a good place to start is to find out what data is collected from individuals and make a list of where this data is kept or sent to. We have to look at our security policies and make sure that handling of personal data is sufficiently covered. We also have to update or prepare clear privacy notices and dialogues to inform individuals and to collect affirmative consent. We must start monitoring the measures we implemented to ensure privacy and protection of data going forward. And we also have to assign responsibilities for both the monitoring and the protection of personal and sensitive data. Okay, that's our preparation for the GDPR. Let's move on to the next slide. This is about personal data ownership, and today we're going to just have a brief look at the biggest changes and challenges that come with the GDPR and data ownership. So this new law is of particular interest to many, perhaps because it brings a number of changes, and it also changes the perspective of personal data security. It's a complex framework and consisting of more than 90 articles and even more recitals. So different things to look out for would be accountabilities, breach notifications, and strict rules that govern international data flows. Personal data is most certainly the focus of the GDPR, but it requires a new perception of sorts, an upgraded view, so to speak. So we're no longer just protecting personally identifiable information, or PII. It's now anything that belongs to someone. So the GDPR concept of personal data now includes location data, IP addresses, and all manner of personal identifiers. Personal data in many cases could be used to identify individuals when combined with unique identifiers. We now also have to be considerate of personal information that individuals may not wish to share with others. Data minimization becomes a recommended approach, and we're encouraged to incorporate pseudonymization of personal data. Basically, as a security measure, pseudonymization can be used to limit the risks and of singling out an individual during data processing. It also allows us to separate meaning from identification. So, for instance, when marketers and analysts work with stats and big data, they should want to see patterns and not people. The GDPR is more specific about classification of personal data and data requiring extra protection. It, for instance, adds genetic data and biometric data to previous definitions of sensitive data. So once again, there are a few things we could do to prepare. And apologies, I jumped the queue. We can document the scope of the data that we collect and process. So if you collect personal data, make sure that you tell the individual what you will be using the data for. This is done through dialogues and updated privacy notices. Also make sure that you request and record consent. The GDPR has some very specific requirements for this, but let's look at more into that later. So also make sure your privacy statements are updated and that you review and consider the GDPR requirements for every point where you collect personal data. Moving on to the GDPR principles. From a UK perspective, the data protection principles on which the GDPR is built remain similar to that of the Data Protection Act, except for a few additions, a few things that have been added, of course. So we have 6 core principles to consider when dealing with personal data. The first being that personal information must be processed fairly and lawfully and in a transparent manner. This, together with the next principle, is of particular importance to understanding the GDPR concept of consent. The second is personal information must only be collected for specified and explicit and legitimate purposes. So communication is key. we must tell individuals what we are collecting their data for, and that we will be careful with it while we have it. So thirdly, personal information must be adequate, relevant and limited to what is necessary relating to the original processing purpose it was collected for. We must make sure that we only collect as much data as is absolutely required for a particular purpose. A lot of data is currently collected by marketers on the basis of we might need it later. The golden rule here is if you can't prove why you need it, do not collect it and definitely don't store it. Next, personal information must be accurate, and going forward, it must be kept up to date. So also, this must be within reason. Not all data needs to be updated all the time. One has to consider the reason for which data is stored. We will, for instance, not be altering financial records or deleting things from an audit trail. The next is personal information may only be retained for as long as is necessary. And lastly, personal information must be processed in an appropriate manner to maintain security. While many of the solutions and approaches to the GDPR requirements that you will see and hear in the next year or so will be focused around solving or dealing with one of these, the 6 principles should, however, be considered together. So an approach that considers all these principles together should guide you on what to do about personal data in preparation for the GDPR. And data controllers and processors will be held accountable and therefore must demonstrate compliance. Every organization will be responsible for ensuring these principles are in place. So what's required of us to measure up to these principles? We must make sure that our role in data processing is clearly defined. And we must accept our responsibility in keeping other people's data safe and private. We must look at the flow of data in our own organization and make sure that the way we collect and work with data would allow us to meet the GDPR accountability requirements. Make use of data protection impact assessments. The Article 29 Working Party released some guidelines on this in April of this year. If you've worked with privacy impact assessments before, this is similar, but it's more granular and incremental. Get ready for checking your DPIA requirements for every project that deals with personal data. And last, but perhaps not least, we must consider privacy by design and default. For every project that deals with personal data, this is something that you want to consider right up front. So just before we move on, here is a link to the Article 29 Working Party document on data protection impact assessments. Okay. Once again, what can we do to prepare? And this we can answer the following questions perhaps about current data processing. So do we know what is the nature of the personal data that we need? How do we collect it? How do we store it? And how do we transmit it? And then look at how is the data protected from incorrect use and access at every point in its journey. We should also start monitoring who we give access to personal data to. Who is accessing it and who are we sharing it with? Technical security measures should include continuous monitoring of files, folders, and data repositories wherever personal data is stored. We want to be able to react to any unauthorized access and data breaches. And on that point, you'll be hearing a lot more about data breaches as companies will start reporting them. Statistically speaking, breaches are no longer a question of if, but rather a question of when. We must keep record of how long different types of personal data is stored and how we protected it from access and tamper while it was in our care. The next section I want to move on to is outsourcing accountability. So let me just start by saying you cannot outsource accountability. This is made clear by the GDPR, where data controllers and data processors are equally responsible for making sure they themselves are compliant and that the failures of the one cannot be blamed on the other. For data controllers, in other words, organizations that decide to collect data and who direct the processing of personal data, the following is required. Data controllers must review all their data processing activities. They must document their data processing activities, and data controllers must update their processing and storage documentation when they collect new types of personal data. They must conduct data protection assessments and identify high-risk processes, and also implement privacy by design and default. Data controllers must define instructions for the data processors which they appoint, and they're also responsible for notifying their supervisory authority in the event of a breach. Data processors are the subcontractors or third parties who process data for the controller. They should do this using a documented instruction provided by the controller. Data processors must implement technical and procedural security measures to protect data, and personal data should be deleted as soon as processing is complete, or when you're receiving an earlier instruction from a controller. Data processors must keep record of data processing activities performed on the instruction of a controller, and information should be shared with controllers to demonstrate the compliance. Data processors must notify controllers immediately in the event of a breach. So what's required of controllers and processors? Preparing. Any organization that outsources data processing to a third party will have to update contracts and instruction manuals and data transfer processes to reflect and meet the new accountability requirements. New contracts should incorporate GDPR requirements. And data controllers and processors must both update their policies with particular focus on data security, data transfers, and audit requirements, and also breach notification. Controllers and processors should have a defined and well-documented procedure for communication and cooperation during breaches. Both controllers and processors should document safeguards against breaches. So what can controllers and processors do to prepare? They should keep records of their activities, both normal operations and when dealing with breaches as well. So for collection and processing of personal data, document how data is collected, stored, and transferred and erased. Security policies should be updated to introduce technical measures such as monitoring to detect anomalies, making sure that the data is accessed only as intended and that it ends up only where it should. Also look at privileged access and how would you find out if you have a user who regularly accesses personal data they don't need. And perhaps auditing your files and folders could help you identify inappropriate or unauthorized access of personal data. Controllers and processors must ensure that technical and procedural security measures are in place to protect personal data. So, moving on to accidents and malice. In any organization, things can go wrong, and data may end up on the wrong desk, incorrectly filed, or sometimes even lost. So in the worst case, data may even be accessed by hackers or leaked or sold, and sometimes even by the people that had legitimate access to it. Data breaches refer to more than just the loss of data or hackers breaking into a network. Think of thieves stealing the server or someone losing a USB stick. A breach can simply mean data ending up where it should not. The GDPR definition calls it any action that can lead to the destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data. So basically anything that happens where it should not, and or some process or activity that was not originally intended. Organizations will have to prepare for when breaches occur and be ready for the action they need to take. The GDPR requires a response without undue delay and within 72 hours. Organizations are required to have a predefined formal breach reporting procedures. So where third parties or processes are used, supply chain reviews and audits must be conducted to test compliance. Technical and organizational measures should be implemented to identify breaches where and when they occur. Technical tools may provide insight into breaches and speed up responses or aid containment. The primary aim when planning for breaches should be reducing the impact and, where possible, rendering data unusable. So what should we do to prepare? We should review and update our security and incident policies and deploy preventative security infrastructure and make sure it's properly configured. The recent ransomware attacks in the news is a good example of technical security configurations that weren't applied correctly. Deploy technical security measures to aid in identifying and reporting breaches. Get experts to help look at your security. If you don't have in-house skills, you could outsource that, but look at tools, test your security, conduct pen tests if your systems are connected to the internet, and consider testing your processes and staff responses. Cliché, I know, but your security is only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. So moving on to the GDPR and its expanded rights. I already mentioned that the GDPR brings about a change in perception and how we must see personal data as belonging to the individuals and how private persons are the true owners of their own data. To make that point, let's look at the new rights that GDPR realizes for EU data subjects. Firstly, there's the right to be informed. Data collectors may no longer keep people in the dark about what they are collecting data for, what they want to do with it, and how long they plan to keep it, and who they will share it with. What used to be just a paper-based cat and mouse game with personal data, the internet and new technology saw that quickly turn into spam, a loss of privacy, 419 emails, and eventually identity theft. Legitimate use of personal data became difficult to distinguish from scams. The GDPR mandates a new level of transparency, which hopefully will give customers back a sense of control and peace of mind. Who knows, this may become something that people look out for, something that maybe builds trust in your future brand. So secondly, we have the right to access. It's not entirely new, however, individuals should now be able to access the data at any time. The normal charge for subject access requests make way for the need for subjects to check that their info is correct and that it's fairly processed. Another new right, but not too unexpected, is the right to restrict data processing. Data subjects can ask controllers not to process data. This is useful in case where data is found to be incorrect. So just an example, how many times must you update your home address when you move house, or when you have to provide proof of address when renting a car, and the assistant tells you that experience says you don't live there? I think this is long overlooked, and it will help organizations that struggle with data quality issues. So hand in hand with the previous one, we have the right to rectification. Data subjects must be allowed to request that incorrect data be corrected. When such a request is received, controllers will have to provide information about what is being done to correct the data. Short from immediate action, the GDPR again references without undue delay. So this must be done quickly, or the controller should stop processing the data. Moving on, the right to erasure is built on earlier designs. You may have heard of the right to be forgotten, and this is no longer just for search engines and social media. When data subjects request removal of their personal data, it should not be held onto for later reuse. There are, of course, things like audit and financial records that you must keep by law. Then there's also the new right to data portability. So someone told me this sounds like it was created for social media applications, but I can't really see how. I don't use Facebook, but for the people that do, where would you move your data to? Anyway, let's use an insurance company as an example. In the insurance world, the concept of transferable no-claim bonuses comes to mind. So in the same way that you have some personal NCB in your data, you might want to transfer this somewhere else to a new insurance provider. So in the same way, data subjects should be allowed to transfer their data securely from one controller to another, almost like keeping your number when you change providers. So before we continue, I just want to look at data subject rights. So as listed on the ICO website, we have the right to be informed, the right of access, the right to rectification, the right to erasure, the right to restrict processing, the right to data portability, the right to object, and rights in relation to automated decision making and profiling. So the last one is major impacts on surveillance tools, cameras, shopping habits, location tracking, and so on. And I wish I could go into it a little bit more, but we'll be here all day, so we're moving on. Right at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a link to the ICO page that you can maybe just visit, and it would tell you a little bit more about that. So in summary, data controllers and processors should stop processing if data is found to be inaccurate or not completely correct. Also, if the data controller or processor finds that the data can no longer be lawfully processed or there's no legitimate reason for processing the data. We'll be paying a lot more attention to data retention policies. And when we no longer have a reason to hold on to personal data or consent is withdrawn, it should be erased. Data should not be kept if the original processing for which it was collected has been completed. If there's a breach, organizations should also stop processing, and generally it can be assumed that you may need to revisit consent and make contact with your data subjects. So once again, what can we do to prepare? We should update our consent dialogues and make sure that we provide privacy notices in clear and plain language at every point where we collect personal data. Keep your data subjects informed. Give them options. Remove mandatory data field restrictions if you don't need them. For instance, if you ask a customer if you should call them back, they would have to provide their number. Otherwise, you would, how would you get that phone call? So the same goes for email. But don't collect email addresses to create a login, to create login accounts and then force customers to sign up to receiving marketing emails. So consent should be clear and explicit and affirmative. The data subject must agree, opt in, and not be forced to hand over personal data unnecessarily. Feeding a big data analytics program is not a reason to collect personal data. Making sure that data processing is documented and that you keep track of where you store personal data. So when you receive a data subject request, you'll need to be sure that you can track down all the instances of the data. Remember to also add backups to your personal data storage register. You need to be able to repeat data erasure actions on data restores. And automate data erasure to ensure that data is removed when processing is complete. So it is time to spring clean your data and make sure that you're not hoarding anything. To counter data breaches, make sure your encryption program is airtight. Lost or stolen data should be useless without a key. Cover yourself by documenting what you do. When things go wrong, you should be able to reassure your data subjects that their data is safe by providing them with information about how their data was encrypted. So quickly moving on to consent. If we have a couple more minutes, I just want to quickly talk about this. And as I mentioned before, you may have come to hear of an alternative reliance on legitimate interest use. And the ICO, for instance, recently requested responses to guidelines to consent. And a number of UK organizations were keen to get the ICO to weigh in on consent. So what the GDPR says about consent, in the next slide, you can see this is article number 7, and it's very clear specifically about what is required. And I just want to point out number 3, the last sentence, where they say, it shall be as easy to withdraw as to give consent. Now that's quite important when you consider collecting consent. You must make sure that you're also able, or you're also allowing your customers or your data subjects to withdraw that consent. So the GDPR is very clear, and we shouldn't take a wait and see approach. Basically, the GDPR approaches the issue from 2 sides. You must get a clear yes and from your data subjects, and if you somehow process data without consent, you should contact the data subject and tell them where you got their data from, and then give them the opportunity to object or request erasure. So basically, there is the concept also of legitimate interest, and it might be used here and there for various reasons. However, at the end of the day, you have to consider that if you don't have consent, you might have to be more careful with your reasons for processing data, and then also you have to consider that your data subject should have the opportunity to object to data processing. So somebody sent me a clarifying quote from the ICO about legitimate interest, and about this they said, the condition puts an emphasis on organizational accountability rather than individual responsibility for giving consent. So basically, proceed with caution if the controller does not have the data subject's permission, and things become more difficult for the controller otherwise. I think this settles the legitimate interest grey area, and it becomes clear that we must ask before we do. So then, finishing up, I just want to say that no talk on the GDPR is complete without mentioning the fines. And I think by this time all the fear-mongering has run its course, and most people have probably already heard of the terrible fines. In case you have not, here's a very simplified version. It's mostly understood that an important aspect of the GDPR is that it's not a tick box certification. If you look good on paper, you're not necessarily in the clear. You will actually have to demonstrate what you are doing to protect data. So in the event of something going wrong, the supervisory authorities are going to first ask you to do that. Hopefully most will have something to show for the GDPR program. And by talking about, say for instance, in a first strike, warning, or slap on the wrist approach, you know, that might be the first responses we see to GDPR and where things might go wrong. However, what is stated is that there is consideration of the 2% of your annual worldwide turnover, and in more serious situations where things have already escalated previously, there is also the 4% fine of an organization's annual worldwide turnover. So if that's not enough, the GDPR also opens the door to class action style and private lawsuits. So data subjects will have a strong voice. If you recall the end of safe harbor for social media operators, there were some involved in lawsuits, and this has already happened. So to conclude, I just want to repeat and summarize as follows. We must recognize that private persons are the true owners of their own data, and that organizations have become accountable as protectors of their of personal data as such. So in conclusion, moving on to some tools from our sponsor, and I want to hand you over to Siddharth from ManageEngine. We'll tell you about ManageEngine's tools and how it can help you prepare for the GDPR. Thank you very much.
Right, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. Um, my name is Siddharth, and I'm from the ManageEngine product team. And as Andre spoke a lot about the GDPR and helped you interpret exactly what the compliance mandate expects of you, what I'm going to be talking about is how you can actually implement a GDPR strategy to improve the data security, because I think a lot of talk is there amongst different security vendors who go about giving information about the GDPR. But most often, at least from what I've seen, a lot of the information tends to be generic, right? So a lot of people, a lot of customers, and a lot of organizations actually are wondering as to what it means to be to have your data secure, as to what it means to comply with the GDPR. Because as Andrea mentioned, it's not something like a checkbox. You need to be able to show to your auditors what are the measures that you have in place in order to comply with the different articles of the GDPR. So that's exactly what I'm going to be showing in this second part of the webinar. So I'm going to speak about how our clear-cut solutions can help you implement your GDPR strategy. And at the end of this session, which is probably going to last another 20 minutes, you can engage with a discussion with us on the live chat to have any of your queries clarified. So before I actually move into our specific tools, I want to talk about how auditing, the power of auditing and alerting can be leveraged using a SIM tool, right? Because now some of you from the security space would obviously know what a SIM tool is. Some people say SIM, some people say SIEM, but let's not be too bothered in this moment as to what a SIM tool is, what the textbook definition for a SIM tool or a log management tool is. Let us be more concerned as to what a SIM tool can do for you, right? Because in the context of the GDPR, the auditing and alerting feature of a SIM tool can help you answer several questions to comply with the GDPR, right? Because for example, if you want to know who is accessing your files and folders, who is accessing and modifying your data, who is accessing and modifying your database rather, these questions can be answered using a SIM tool, right? So let's look at what exactly that entails. So a SIM tool is essentially going to use log data from different devices and is going to collect these logs and give you some and help you answer these many questions. So this involves first setting up an audit policy on the particular system. So if in case you're looking at a Windows server, you would go and configure the local or group policy on the machine so that that particular machine will start generating logs for the events of concern. In this case, these could be narrowed down to things related to data access. So once you set up this optimal audit policy, your SIM tool is going to collect all these logs, analyze them by trying to correlate different logs for the different events that it collects, and then it can alert you when something bad happens or when something suspicious is happening. And most importantly here, you can archive all these log data, because remember, log data contains information about every event that is happening in your IT infrastructure. So you can archive these logs so that you can run reports to show your auditors that you have these systems in place for complying with the GDPR. And also, in case something goes wrong, you are in a position to backtrack the particular data breach and show your auditors a complete forensic report. So in short, this is how a SIM tool's auditing and alerting feature can help you meet the different articles of the GDPR. So I just wanted to talk about this so that you can relate to what I'm talking about in the rest of the slides, where I'm going to show you about our SIM tool, and that would be Log360. So we made a comprehensive SIM tool called Log360 last year by combining two existing modules of two modules of our products. So we combined Event Log Analyzer with AD Audit Plus so that you can track every single important event occurring in your IT infrastructure, and you can run audit reports, and be alerted for important events. So that's in short what I talked about in the last slide of how you can use a SIM tool to audit every important event and data accesses and things like that, and be alerted for when things go wrong. Right? So in short, Event Log Analyzer's component deals with monitoring your network devices and your databases and web servers and other applications. And AD Audit Plus is focused on auditing your Active Directory infrastructure in your Windows Server. And these two tools combine together to form Log360. So now I'm going to talk about exactly how Log360 can help you meet different GDPR requirements. So one of the most important things though is to stay on top of the 4 vital W's, right? Because this is sort of a general hard and fast rules, if you will, on what are the things that you need to know about your data, right? You need to know when it comes to data or any resource in your network, but for today's context, let's just think about data. You need to know the 4 vital W's, which is who made the change to a particular object, which object was changed, when was the change made, and what the new value is versus the old value, right? So if you are in a position to answer these 4 vital W's, so you've got a lot of confidential files and folders, confidential objects, and if you're able to answer these 4 questions to me, that you know who made every single change, which was the object in question that was being changed, when was the change made by the person, and what the new value is compared to the new value, compared to the old value. So if you have a system in place to answer these 4 questions, I think you're in a good shape. However, if you are not able to answer these questions about data accesses and data modifications, then you need a special tool to do that for you, right? So the first thing, let us look at access controls and permissions, right? Here are the things that you need to do with regards to access controls and permissions. So an obvious step is to provide personal data access only for those who need it, right? If you have confidential data in your files and folders, ensure that your objects and your Active Directory definitions are done so that only the right people have access to the particular set of data in concern. So of course you need to have a method of authorization to ensure that users who need to access a particular piece of confidential information get authorized before proceeding to view or modify the data. So the only way you can ensure that all these accesses and modifications are being done by the right people is by auditing changes to accesses and permissions, right? Because you will set up a policy. You're going to set up your audit policy and your SACL configuration. Great, that's great. But after that, you need to continuously monitor the changes made to the access and permissions in order to ensure that only the right people are accessing the data after a proper procedure for authorization. So you need to do this continuous auditing of your infrastructure. So I'm going to just jump into our tool. I have a few simulations already set up so that I can quickly run you exactly what we can do with our tool. So with regards to access controls and permissions, the AD Audit Plus component of Log360 can help you track unauthorized accesses to important objects, to important data. So you can track, as you can see on this screen, you can track every logon failure to understand if anyone is trying to make an unauthorized access to a particular Active Directory object. So what makes this tool really easy to use is that all these reports that you see on the left-hand side, all these report categories, you have so many report categories with several predefined reports underneath them, which means that you don't need to go ahead and configure and run these reports by yourself. As soon as you add your domain controller to our tool, our tool starts giving you these reports predefined, meaning you don't need to configure anything, and these results can be extracted out of the box. So here you can see important data to help you understand who is trying to access what, because you can see who the username who had the failed logon, you can see the domain controller, you can see the reason for the failed logon, you can see the time, the event type, and all the other IT technical details that you need. So this kind of data, because you have this kind of data inside a tool, you can show your auditors that you have in place a system to track logon activity and ensure that only the right and authorized people are gaining access to important servers. So that's one thing. Now the next thing, since we're still talking about Active Directory, is that in your Active Directory, you're going to have different groups. And these different groups come with different privileges. Now, if by chance someone who's not supposed to have access to a particular piece of data is moved to another group which has access to that particular piece of data, that is a major red flag for your security. So when such users change their group membership, you can be alerted in real time that this particular user was moved to this group at this time. So you get the real-time alert, and then you can quickly change that user back to the Active Directory group that they belong to. So here what you can do is you can simply search, for example, the administrator group is often the group that has all the privileges. So if by chance a normal user is moved into the administrator group, that is, if the administrator group has any changes, this is something that you need to track in real time and get alerts for when these critical changes happen, because a single critical change made to your critical components like your GPO or your domain controller can jeopardize your data security. And this is something that I want to stress upon immensely, because it's just one single change, one critical change made to your GPO or to your domain controller that can create a loophole in your security system and maybe allow someone who is not supposed to have access to a particular file or folder, and they will get access to that simply because of a single Active Directory change. So what this means is that you need to track such group membership changes and be alerted for in real time, say when any administrator group has a modification. So I have a few reports pre-configured here, and maybe I can just type modified administrator. So you can see I've got modified admin groups in AD Manager, ADAuditPlus.com, so which is the domain that we created for the simulation. So here you can track which administrator groups were modified and when they were modified, and in case the modification was creating a loophole, that is, it was creating maybe someone had an escalation of privileges and which allowed them to access data that they weren't supposed to, you can get these sort of alerts in real time with our tool, and you can take the steps to quickly mitigate a potential internal attack to your data to your data. So that was with a little bit of idea as to what you could do from your Windows Server and Active Directory infrastructure point of view. Now, apart from that, apart from the access controls and permissions, you also got to audit your data storage systems themselves. So typically, and you're gonna have files and folders, and you're gonna have databases. Now, these could store data that is confidential to both your business, and more importantly, it could store customer sensitive information. And when we talk about data security, obviously securing our files and folders and databases is going to be the primary concern. So again, just jumping back to our tool AD Audit Plus, this is the dashboard view, just to give you an idea of what are the different things that you can get out of this tool, that you can see alerts being triggered right here on the right hand pane. You can also have these alerts emailed to you or sent to you as an SMS as per your requirement. And what you can see in the dashboard is essentially an overview of everything that is happening inside your Active Directory infrastructure. Everything right from the logon failures to the account management. You can customize, of course, as to what information you'd like to see. But the whole, you get a huge bunch of data really and alerts for the right set of events so that you can show your auditors that you have such a tight system in place to track who is accessing the data and also to check in case anyone by mistake, any loophole was created in your security system, you can get alerted for that in real time. But coming back to auditing our files and folders themselves, so you've got a component here specifically for auditing your files and folders. And what you can see here is essentially a bunch of reports. Maybe let me just look at, say, all file and folder changes. So you can see all the deletes, the creations, the modifications, the files and folders that were moved, and the files and folders that were renamed for a particular time duration on your file server. So what the tool gives you is a huge bunch of data that is important to complying and implementing your GDPR security program at your fingertips, because you don't need to run these reports by doing any sort of manual configuration. As soon as you add your domain controller or your file server, you can start extracting this information out of the box from the tool. So since we're talking about files and folders, for example, I can see for a particular user a summary of all the file accesses and the file modifications made by them. All it took me was one click and I have all this information collected by the tool that I can present to the auditor to say that I have these systems in place to track who is accessing and modifying data on my files and folders. And again, when we're talking about files, you can see a bunch of reports here. Maybe I look at the files that were modified in the last 24 hours. And here I can again see in-depth information as to who is doing the modification, the IP address, and a whole bunch of details really that has been collected by the tool and can be exported as a report for your auditors. So this was one part of the data storage components, which are your files and folders. But you also have databases, which again could be storing important customer sensitive information. So for that, I'm going to jump to the event log analyzer component of Log360 and show you how you can do the same thing for files and folders for your databases as well. So for example, in my demo setup, just as with AD Audit Plus, I can get a complete idea of what is going on in my network infrastructure at a single glance using the dashboard view. But specifically, since we're concerned about databases, I'm going to just jump to applications under the report categories. And say I have an Oracle database, I've got a bunch of reports here to track events occurring on the Oracle server. So just as we tracked fail logons in the case or in the context of Active Directory, we can do the same here for the Oracle server. And you can see I get the data of the device, of the username, and all the other information such as the time of the fail logon instantly in a single click. So with this, I can track unauthorized attempts being made to my database and find out if any potential, if there is any potential threat to the data in the database. So even apart from this, even apart from just fail logons, the scope of auditing your database is quite big, and you can also audit things like your DDL changes, your DML changes, and maybe I'm looking at modified tables in the database, or rather the altered databases. So you can see which were the tables in your database modified. And again, you can find out things like who modified them, when they were modified, and things like that. Different parameters. You've got attributes like the terminal, the object creator, and so on. So in this way, what we've seen so far is we've first looked at auditing access controls and permissions, which we saw is done in real time, and the information can be pulled out just in a matter of few clicks really. And then we've seen how we can audit the data storage components themselves. We can track modifications and accesses being made to our file and folder systems as well as our databases. So there's really a huge scope, like I said, of the different things that you can audit. But of course, since we are short for time, I really can't go through every single report. But I hope you can see what are the many things that can be achieved using an auditing tool. Because with a tool like this, not only are you getting pre-configured reports that you can show to your auditor to say that you have all these systems in place, but you can also get real-time alerts so that you can detect if you're experiencing a data breach, and you can quickly take steps to curb it. So before we conclude, that brings me to my final slide where I say, what if you have a data breach, right? Because yes, you can have systems in place, you can have a solid auditing and alerting tool in place, but in case you get breached as well, the GDPR expects you to notify in the next 72 hours after the breach, right? So this is a really important requirement of the GDPR. In case you have a security incident like a data breach, you need to ensure that within 72 hours, you can inform the authority. Because remember, any compliance regulation like the GDPR isn't out there to just get you. It's not that you get breached and the GDPR auditor says, we're going to fine you. When they're going to fine you is if they found you and your organization to be negligent to data security, right? So in case you do encounter a breach and it was found that you didn't have the right set of systems in place to track accesses and modifications to your data, in case they find that, that is when you get a really hefty fine for the data breach. So an auditing tool like ours, Log360, can do for you so much more even if you get breached, because you have in place a mechanism to file an incident report, right? Because like I said, within 72 hours, you got to inform the authority that this particular data breach has occurred, and you need to file the reason why this data breach occurred, and also what were the systems that you had in place to stop this particular data breach. So in filing an incident report, here is where again our tool can come in, because just similar to the example we saw about auditing your databases, your databases are prone to attacks like SQL injection. So in case you get attacked by a SQL injection attack, let me just log into the demo setup. So in case you get attacked, your database encounters an attack, you will be in a position to detect such an attack like SQL injection, and also show your auditors that you knew that this SQL injection attack happened at this time from this IP address, and here's what you did to stop the attack. Because if they find an accountable system in place, they really can't touch you. So let me just show you. I have a pre-configured alert for detecting SQL injection in our tool. So you can see I've got a SQL injection alert for the Apache web server. So once you've configured such an alert, what you can do to get more data in case this particular alert gets triggered is jump to your report console and get more data about the incident. So in this case, it's a SQL injection on my Apache web server. So I'm just going to go look at the predefined report for SQL injection. Maybe just change the time frame since we've simulated the data. So instantly, I'll be able to understand important information about the attack, that is about the data breach, on which IP address caused the attack, more data such as the web server status codes, the bytes transferred, the exact request that led to the attack, and the time when the attack occurred. So in this case, what happens is I have a system where I get the alert for a SQL injection attack, and I quickly can do damage control. Plus, I have the information in real time that this particular incident has happened in my IT infrastructure, and easily within the 72 hours, I can give the authorities a foolproof incident report that tells them what the data breach was, the nature of the data breach, which in this case was a SQL injection attack. And I can also figure out the categories and the number of data subjects and personal data records that were compromised. Plus, you can furnish additional details that the GDPR expects you to have in place, such as the details of the DPO, the measures that your enterprise adopted to stop attacks, and the potential consequence of the attack or breach that has taken place. So in short, what you can do with a tool like Log360 is that you can audit important events occurring in your enterprise to be alerted for events that could potentially lead to a data breach. And also, in case you have a data breach, you are in a position to show your auditors a clear-cut incident report that tells everything about the data breach and also of the systems that you had in place to stop the attack. So long as you are able to audit all the accesses and permissions, permission changes to your important data, and if you're able to be alerted for suspicious events that could prove to be that could become a threat to your data security, if you're able to achieve these things, that will go a long way in complying with the GDPR, because you've got one set of things that talks about the rights of the data subjects. But one thing that I have seen so far is that a lot of IT teams are not sure exactly how to handle the requirements pertaining to the data security, right? Because some of the things like obtaining consent from your customers, that is something that you'll quickly be able to implement. But a data security program requires a cutting-edge tool such as ManageEngine's Log360 to really be able to tell your auditors that you have a clear-cut auditing and alerting mechanism in place so that you can detect data breaches and overall tighten the security of an individual's data. So I was just trying to rush through because we are a little bit short for time because of a slight delay at the start. But I hope I've given you a brief idea about how our tool can help you leverage the power of auditing and alerting in order to implement your GDPR security program. So we are here now on the live chat to answer any questions that you may have about implementing a GDPR security strategy, as well as any questions about our tool. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. And in case you have any further queries, you can let us know on the live chat.